Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. For those of you that are just joining us, my name is Christopher Ruskowski, and I'm moderating today's virtual conference. I'll pass the microphone back over to Professor Peterson in just a moment to introduce our keynote speaker, Assistant Secretary Blue, who has joined us, and welcome to him. But before I do that, I just want to do a couple of reminders. One is that we are recording this conference today. And so a reminder to the panelists and to all the speakers that we're recording. And then secondly, with the keynote slot this afternoon, it is a 45-minute session, which will be kicked off by Professor Peterson. He'll then hand the microphone over to our keynote for some remarks. And then hopefully at around 12:25, 12:30, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, which similar to the morning. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar, and then I will do my best to synthesize and pose those questions to Assistant Secretary Blue. So that's how this will go here during this 45 minutes. Without further ado, it's 12:01. Professor Peterson, over to you.
So thank you, CR. I am delighted to be able to present James Blue to you all for the keynote event of the conference. Jim Blue is the Assistant Secretary for Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development at the U.S. Department of Education. Before that, he was deeply engaged in the education reform movement across the country. He was a director of 50 CAN in California. He was the national president of Students First. He was the national director for the Alliance for School Choice, and his predecessor, the American Education Reform Council. So he has a distinguished career in this enterprise that so many of us here gathered today are engaged in, and we're extremely grateful for his leadership at the U.S. Department of Education over the past several years. So thank you, Jim, for joining us today.
Thank you, Paul. It may feel like years. It's really just been months at the U.S. Department of Education. I have to say, I'm delighted to be here today, and I just have to say you have put together just a bang-up program. Many people that I have been working alongside for 20 years to improve education outcomes for our children are part of your panels. As I look at the list, I wish policymakers in DC would listen to more to the people who are in your panel today than some of the people they normally hear from. I should say the secretary sends her regrets. Paul knows that she was we hoped would be the keynote speaker and just had a conflict. And so I will be trying to step in for her today. Paul said I could talk about anything. I try to keep my comments to about 10, maybe 15 minutes if I run long. And the topic I want to really focus in on is the federal role in education and in education reform. I think as we get into the question and answers, I'll get into a lot more topics, including how you make good student-centered policy in a hyper-partisan world. Let me acknowledge right up front that I'm going to largely ignore the federal role and the department's role in higher education. I'll happily answer questions about it. I want to recognize the irony of that. More than half of the department's employees are now working on the higher ed side of policy and execution. And in terms of dollars, just the amount of money that goes out in terms of student loans, Pell Grants, is about 3, almost 4 times more than what we are putting into K-12 education at this point. And in fact, in higher ed, federal spending represents about 40% of the total and growing over time, while the departments and the federal role in K-12 education is this last year prior to the pandemic was just 7%. This is a fact I like to always make sure I include in my presentations, because there are a lot of people who wonder why a 7% investor has so much influence over education policy in this country. Usually when I'm speaking publicly, I'm careful to draw out 3 points, and I'll just make those up front and then focus on the federal role at the back end. The first point is always that we need to reform our factory-based model of education in K-12. But fortunately, there will be a lot of other content. I looked at the program, I saw what Rick Hanishek's paper. A lot of other people are making the case that we are failing completely about a quarter of our children, and there's another 40 to 50% that we're serving, you could at best say mediocrely. So I won't dwell on that, but I hope that everybody appreciates that there is a need for reform because our system is failing too many students. I then talk about how education reform, reformers have a lot of different points of views. You will hear many of those during the conference today. But we all tend to agree on 3 basic facts or strategies. One is that we believe the system needs to have a lot more transparency about its own performance of its at the classroom level, school level, state level. I'll just note that the system itself and those who defend the status quo, the factory-based model, are not in favor of transparency. And we can talk more about that later during questions and answers. The second thing we usually agree on is that there is a need for accountability for performance. Again, within the community, there's a lot of discussion about what that accountability looks like, whether it should be federally based, whether it should be market-based. But generally, we agree that there has to be more accountability for performance. Again, the system itself and the status quo defenders don't want accountability. And if you disagree with me about that, I think you'll need to explain to me why, after spending hundreds of millions of dollars to resolve how you teach children to read, that more than half of our education schools still refuse to follow what science tells them they should do. You might also question if there's accountability that we have so many, and I'm not saying it's a large percentage, but there are a number of chronically ineffective teachers who are still allowed to work in classrooms and get their wages and benefits increased year after year. The final thing that most reformers agree on is school choice. That, of course, is my signature issue. It is the Secretary's signature issue. And there's a reason we focus on that. We think it's probably the lever that will lead to the most transformation of our system. Again, I'll acknowledge that there's a lot of disagreement among reformers about what school choice should look like. The Secretary and I, and one of the co-sponsors of the event, Ed Choice today, we believe that everything should be on the table, that parents are in the best position to decide what education, what model, what school meets their needs best. But there are other people in the ed reform movement who, for example, believe that only charter schools should be the option available beyond the traditional public school system. Those are my main points that I make whenever I'm speaking. My third point is always that school choice needs to be part of the reform agenda. And there are a lot of people who would like to just focus on transparency and accountability. And that's my segue to the federal role. I think it's particularly important, given the federal role right now, that it do something to encourage more options available for more families. Over the last couple of decades, that's mostly focused on public charter schools. And I don't need to tell you my credentials around that. I hope you all know that that is a core value of mine, that we should be expanding charter schools. I actually got my start in the movement because I decided to volunteer to help a group of community leaders start a charter school in Watts, Los Angeles. But we are now promoting a much larger agenda than that. And it takes the form of what are called education freedom scholarships. You know, there's for all of any advocate knows the old saying about first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, and then they fight you like hell. Secretary DeVos has tenaciously pursued these education freedom scholarships, what has recently been redubbed the School Choice Now Act, since she took office. And we are bearing the fruits of those activities. Yesterday in the Senate, you may know that the Senate voted 52-47 for a skinny stimulus bill. That was not enough to close debate and to get the vote on the substance. And so it has often been portrayed in the media as a defeat for a success for the Democrats to get 47 votes. For those of us who pursue education reform, is a new high watermark because a key part of that bill, 20% of the funding, was education. And that was a key principle in there was the School Choice Now Act. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, because people have been saying it was dead on arrival and would never get anywhere, you know, was an attempt to ignore it. All that is it's founded on a tax credit, which is not really a federal program, but it is a tax credit that would encourage donations to scholarship organizations that are then run by states. I'm happy to get into all of the details about that. But in the midst of a pandemic and a crisis where we saw so many options disappearing, particularly in low income and middle class communities, the Senate caucus and we agreed there needed to be an immediate infusion into securing those options, supporting those options across America. So in addition to the tax credit, it now also includes an directed appropriation that would go to governors and then to scholarship granting organizations. I'm happy to take more questions about the School Choice Now Act and why that's an important part of the federal role. But let me end with sort of the, once this bill passes, and I do think inevitably it will be part of the package if there is a fourth stimulus package, there will be an opportunity to rethink what the federal role should be. Let's talk history a little bit here. Most of the people on this call probably understand that there was not a Department of Education until 1980. But the federal role has long preceded that. And one key role, which continues today, is that the federal government collects a lot of statistics, does a lot of research. That's focused in what's called our Institute for Education Sciences, IES. They have about a $600 million budget to do that year after year. It does not, however, need to be part of the larger Department of Education. A second function, I think we can all agree on, was that the department takes on the role of enforcing our civil rights laws. That happened because of some egregious behavior that finally came to a head in the 60s, and that then became the law long before there was a Department of Education. I bring that up because, again, the Office of Civil rights that does our work in that area, has about $100 million budget. Does not need to be within the department. And there are a lot of people who think that it might be more effective if it was combined with EEOC. So we have one unit of government pursuing our civil rights enforcements in the workplace as well as schools and universities. The last area is that the first with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, later with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Congress decided that it was a good idea for the federal government to come alongside local districts and help them with our most vulnerable children, our economically disadvantaged children and our students with disabilities. And that, again, does not necessarily need to be done by the Department of Education. And in fact, the secretary last year in her budget proposal suggested that we take at least one big hunk of money and present it as a block grant to states with as few strings as possible so that states would be able to decide for themselves how best to spend those limited resources. Again, 7% of the money at the local level. So I do want to provoke a conversation today about a completely different way of looking at the federal role than has been our history, and that is being presented in this presidential debate by the Democratic Party. So with that, Chris, I don't call you CR, Chris, because of that means a continuing resolution in my world. Chris, please, I'll let you take the floor from here.
No, well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. We have a handful of questions that have already come in, but I'll just start here with a member of the audience that just said point blank, I want to hear more details about the Freedom Scholarships Plan, how it would work, and whether or not you think it will pass.
Yeah. Cut me off if I go on too long about this, Chris. But let me start with the second half of this. I think it's inevitable that this bill passes. I've been saying that since it was introduced. And here's why. The Republican Party recognizes that it needs to have a coherent policy around school choice and education reform. And that has now been accomplished. You have every Republican senator saying that's something I can get behind. I should note there was one exception, which is Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, who I think just cannot swallow the amount of money, even the $500 billion that was embedded in the skinny stimulus. And then let's talk about the Democratic side. Many people on the call know that I was a Democrat until just recently. And here's the dilemma that Democrats face. They have a teacher union support for their policies and their political infrastructure that dominates education policy making. So it's really rare to find any Democrat who's willing to stand up to the teacher unions and say, I'm for transparency, accountability, and more choice for parents. And they make it very difficult to do that. On the other hand, they have a real dilemma. And the dilemma is this. Their constituents, their voters, are wildly in favor of school choice. You see that in poll after poll. In fact, Harvard and EdNext recently did a poll showing this, that in particular, the tax credit scholarships that we're proposing score in really incredibly high levels, 70%, 80% for Black and Latino families. And so when you have a dilemma like that, I think inevitably the Democrats will be looking for a way to provide their constituents more choice. So that said, let me get into do you want to follow up on that, or should I talk about it?
Go ahead.
So the key principle is that it's a federal one-for-one tax credit. So anybody who wants to support scholarships would donate to a scholarship granting organization and get a one-for-one credit for it. This includes both individuals and businesses, individuals would be able to donate up to 10% of their AGI, and businesses, domestic corporations, would be able to donate up to 5% of their net taxable income. This is really hard for people to understand because it means that everything would be funded through voluntary donations. Scholarship granting organizations would be voluntary nonprofits. Schools and families that participate would be voluntarily involved. And it's difficult because our K-12 system has become so compulsory over the last 100 years, where people are forced to do things. It's really hard for people to get their heads around it, but that's a very, very important principle. The second thing is that it's not one program. It's literally 54 programs if you count Puerto Rico, the District of Columbia, the outlying areas, et cetera, the Bureau of Indian Education. And what that means is that everybody will get to design the scholarship program that works best for their communities. And that includes a whole variety of scholarships. Like the traditional view of scholarships is that it has to go to a K-12 private school. And in this country right now, where 70% of the, education is in that sector is done by the Catholic schools, people often think, oh, you're talking about Holy Spirit, St. Holy Spirit down the street. But that is not the requirement in the law. You can create education savings accounts and let parents decide how to do an unbundled education where they are maybe pursuing or getting some special need therapies with part of their money, and getting a curriculum and doing a pandemic pod with other parents. So it's really whatever creativity the governors want to bring to it. I have to say, when we talk to governors, one of the most popular ideas is using these scholarships for career and technical education, and particularly as an alternative to a traditional high school, so that it gives students a chance to begin apprenticeships, beginning their careers earlier. Probably went on too long there, Chris, but did you want to stop or ask anything more?
No, well, actually, I want to switch gears because I think there's a couple other questions here from the audience that I want to get to. This one's actually from Matt Barnum at Chalkbeat. And he wanted to ask about the recent rulings from 3 federal judges striking down the department's rule on private school aid under the CARES Act. He wants to know the department's current position on the rule, particularly whether you plan to move forward with an appeal, and wondering if you can speak to concerns that USED's position may have created additional uncertainty and difficulty for LEAs and schools who may be sitting on CARES dollars in escrow while this rule and while this matter is being worked out.
Great. Good to hear you're out there, Matt. I have to say, Matt's the kind of guy, the kind of reporter who, when I say 29, he will do an article later about I should have said 28. So I'll be very, very precise about how I say this. First of all, Matt, it is not aid to private schools the way most people think of it. We're talking about what's known as equitable services. That has been part of federal law now for 40 years. And it's literally that it requires the local education agency, the LEA or school district, to provide services equitably to private school students and teachers as it does to its traditional public schools. So number one, it's not money that's flowing to private schools. Number two, we were sincere. We believed that the CARES Act was not a Title I program. We thought it was meant to serve all students. But as you note, Matt, the federal court in DC has vacated our rules on this. They've said that they are no longer to be enforced. And the default now is that the money that would be set aside to provide those services would now be determined by Title I formulas. And so let me just acknowledge we are We recognize that reality and we are looking at next steps. For us, top of mind is what you said, Matt. We want to make sure students are being served. We want to make sure all students are being served. And this, as we recognize, caused some paralysis out in the field. We've told districts they should continue doing equitable services for their private school students and teachers. And if you disagree with the way we're approaching this, at least put the money aside in an escrow account. And a lot of districts have done that, and that's proving to be a wise strategy. We have a key decision in front of us of whether we're going to appeal that and elongate this controversy and keep those funds locked up. I think that there's a lot of consideration of that top of mind because we hold ourselves accountable to doing student-centered policy making, and right now we're recognizing that students may be being hurt because of the approach if we were to continue it. I hope that's helpful.
So, Assistant Secretary, here's a question from Mike Petrilli at the Fordham Institute, which is, given the paper that was presented this morning at the conference, not to mention the many mentions of support for charter schools at the Republican National Convention, would the administration be willing to reverse its 2020 budget proposal to fold the federal charter schools program, the CSP, into a block grant, which would effectively zero it out, to use Mike's words there? Yeah.
Hi, Mike. We disagree on this one. We don't think it would zero it out. You used to work at the department, so I can't really talk about the FY22 budget. It was, by the way, the 21 budget where we made that proposal, although we made it in 20. Let me just sort of reflect on this. I think the focus on the charter school program has been hugely beneficial to the charter school sector. But let's get some framing around this. Most of the money that's flowing to charter schools does not come through that account. I think that only about half of charter schools have ever received any of that startup money, and that it's a small fraction compared to the amount of money that's flowing from state and local governments. So is it more important to maintain a fund that is proven to be a good venture capital fund on behalf of charter schools, or is it more important to maximize the amount of money that states have control over so they can decide what's best for them? I argue to any governor that one of the best things they can do is to continue growing their charter school sectors. And I would hope that more than the $440 million that is now set aside in the budget for the charter school program will begin to flow through those federal dollars. Because after all, we give about close to $30 billion each year to districts, and giving them more flexibility how they use it could lead, we believe, to more investment in charter schools.
So, Assistant Secretary, I'm going to see if there's a couple more questions from the audience here. So I'll remind the audience to, again, put your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of the webinar. In the meantime, another one of our panelists, probably someone that wants to know about your future. Do you plan to stay on with the administration if President Trump is reelected?
Yeah, so I have promised myself not to think about that until after Election Day. So I'll decide that. And look, I'll be honest with people. The Secretary and I will at that point make a calculation about whether we can be more effective within the federal government or outside of it. Both of us remain committed to the cause either way. I think we have learned the bully pulpit, the ability to work with inside of administration to get their policies aligned with student-centered approaches. Those are all hugely important. And so if I had to say today, I would say that our calculation will be, we'll stay.
So you can imagine, Assistant Secretary, there's a couple of follow-ups to the conversations that have been opened, but I want to tackle some new ground before we maybe go back to those, which is a question from one of our chairs around, I think it's around micro schooling is where the question is about, as a unique and growing option for families. You know, what is the department's approach and position towards programs like the one that's referenced here is the one that's happening in North Las Vegas in Clark County. But even if you're not familiar with that option, you know, where's the department stand on micro schooling as an option for parents and families?
Yeah, look, part of my response here is going to be very predictable. We're supportive of parents having more power to take control of their education, of the education of their children. And so we applaud it. We're also, forgive us, but we're pointing out that this is happening due to a complete failure of our factory-based model system to come forward and educate children and take care of even the custodial needs of children. So for us, it is a point that sometimes is lost in the debate. Our system needs to be reformed, and that families are taking their own responsibility for this, to us, just proves it. But here's something that may surprise you. I do have concerns about the pandemic pods, the micro schools, and that is that many families cannot access this option. And that's not equitable, that's not fair, that's not good for the families. And we believe that when governors have the resources, that they should be giving them directly to families so they have the power themselves. Because right now, this is a phenomenon that is being limited to more affluent families in America, often with two parents taking care of children, and often with college degrees. We think that should be available more broadly, and we would encourage it through scholarships and school choice.
So, one of our audience members has a big philosophical question that I think you'll appreciate, which is just where you stand on the purpose of public education in the 21st century.
Yeah. So I believe that the role of public education is to come alongside each unique child and bring them to their full potential. And I also believe that our factory-based model cannot get there. We need a very different approach to education so that we can see things that, Public Summit Schools is on the agenda later on. They meet every child exactly where they are, and they help develop their potential. Our system is not built to do that, and we need to get there.
Okay, we're in a bit of a lightning round now here, Assistant Secretary, for the next 11 minutes. So here's a on-the-nose question. Is USED willing to provide federal funding to LEAs, districts, charters, et cetera, that teach only online as of October 15th?
That's not something we determine, that's something Congress determines. Our position has been that if you are not meeting the needs of your families with a fully operational education system, and for us, that can be online, but for most parents, they want it physically in person. And let me just pause on that for a second. Like, what's often getting lost in this debate is that most children, given the current state of our education system, would be far better off physically in school than to keep schools closed. And often that's lost here. There are exceptions. If you happen to be the kind of family that can create a rigorous homeschool, you're probably better off continuing to do that. If you're lucky enough to attend Public Summit Schools or one of the other high-performing charters that is doing remote instruction well, you're probably better off there. But on the whole, most parents would choose right now to go back to school. And that is like getting lost in the debate right now. So all that to say, we would try and meet the needs of families that would like to be in school. And if they're denied that option, our preference would be to give those federal resources to the families so they can get online, get the resource and try and do this. But I think Congress's preference would be simply get schools to open and do what's best for kids.
All right, so Assistant Secretary, we're going to stick with this lightning round theme because the questions are flooding in here at the final moment. So here's one about the federal role that you talked about earlier. Can and will federal policies aimed at public charter schools, school choice expansion, be able to override or influence states such as Massachusetts that currently have charter school caps?
Yeah. So I know there's a lot of pressure from the ed reform community to start pressuring governors to do the right thing through fiat. And you know, by the way, Governor Charlie Baker is not somebody we need to put pressure on. He's a complete ally in expanding choices for families. But this is something really, and it took me a while to understand how strongly the Secretary feels about this and the wisdom of it. We have to let states and districts do what they think is right, even when we disagree. And so if Massachusetts insists on continuing its caps on charter schools, which I will happily publicly put pressure on them for what an inane position that is. But to tell them you can't have caps anymore, that goes beyond the Secretary's comfort level, because there is great wisdom in letting 50 experiments around how to educate children go on in this country, because none of us have figured it out. And so letting that variety happen without dictates from Washington, D.C. is a pretty important principle.
Assistant Secretary, again, sorry for jumping all over the place here, but
this is my job, Chris.
Okay,
this is
all right. I got
day.
you. So here's another question about the CSP. For single site charter schools, for single site newcomers to the space, it really has been one of the only sources of funding to launch new schools, particularly single sites. So are you concerned, and the panelist here cites a new paper that we're happy to send around about the implications of the CSP no longer existing for those single site newcomers? So I think she wants you to respond to that. Yes. Well,
so first of all, I have to point out that it is not the only source, and nor should it be, right? So in some ways, the federal government's role here has enabled people to sit out the very necessary investment in single site charter schools. It wasn't part of my introduction, but most of you know that I worked for 10 years for the Walton family. And in the process, we were the other major source of doing single site investment. And I think in many ways, our investments were more important because it was, as they say, green money. They were given $250,000 to get their site up and running, and there were none of the strings that go along with the federal funds. I would like to see governors take their new block grants and use it to invest in single sites. There's nothing stopping them from doing that now, except they don't need to because the federal government's doing it. And I'd like to see a lot more philanthropy step up and help launch new schools.
All right, let's talk a little social studies curriculum. As I'm sure is on your radar screen, Senator Tom Cotton had a proposal or a bill out there that threatened to defund schools that taught the 1619 project. Where is the administration right now on the social studies curriculum and these various issues that are colliding around it?
Yeah. I like to give direct answers, Chris, and this is a hard one because the administration doesn't have a well-developed policy around this yet. We're working on it, but here's some principles. Social studies are really important. Understanding the arc of history, understanding the American story, those are very important issues, and they are often underplayed because of our focus on math and reading. By the way, math and reading are critical too. This is a both and observation. I'm not actually familiar with Senator Cotton's bill, so I don't want to, but I don't think this is why this issue is so fraught, because there are many ways to interpret the arc of American history. And coming from my background, I think they should all be on the table. We should be talking about all of them, welcoming discussion of them. But I don't think we should say that any one of them is the orthodoxy, that we can only teach this type of social studies or view of civics. But I hope we can all agree that history is important, understanding our Constitution and how civics works in this country. Those are all things that are getting undercovered right now by our education system.
So here's a final question from the audience, Mr. Assistant Secretary, and then we'll go back to you for any final thoughts of things you might want to share in closing. And it's about COVID-19. So from a federal policymaker point of view, if you had known then what you know now about the impact of COVID-19, what might you have done differently? What guidance on school safety or pandemic funding support would you have promoted? So it's an opportunity to reflect on what we know now and put it in the 2020 rearview mirror.
Yeah, I haven't thought about this question, but let me tell you, we did some things right, and I'm grateful for those now. One is we realized very early on that we are not health experts and that we needed to rely on the Center for Disease Control and Prevention to be giving the kinds of guidance about how to operate schools in this area. And I have to say that was a very good decision. It is one that has frustrated people because of long history. They wanted the federal government to tell them what to do. The secretary was very clear, we don't know better than the CDC. And even if we thought we did, it would be a mistake to tell people that they should do one thing or the other. And I guess that would be my principle. I don't think we would change that. So I don't regret that. I think I'm seeing more and more of the wisdom of having done it.
I lied. I'm going to ask you one more question.
It's all right.
So you mentioned the role of philanthropy, and obviously you're uniquely positioned given your experience in philanthropy and at the federal level. Are you at all concerned about the role of philanthropy, not just with the public charter school sector and the conversation we had earlier about seed funding for new sites, but more broadly? I think the comment from our panelist was, when Walton jumped out, it wasn't like a bunch of other foundations and philanthropists jumped in. And so maybe a few comments from you on the state of educational philanthropy.
Wow. So I wish I could roll back the last 45 minutes because I have a lot to say about this issue. But let me just say this. The sector, it's healthy in terms of developing theories of change and investing in them. My concern is that they change their theories and strategies. It seems every 6 months at this point. They are following what public interest is. And, sometimes that's very productive. After having wired 98% of the country, philanthropy is now realizing there's still a huge digital gap, particularly at home. So a lot of philanthropy is pursuing that. I think that's great. So the final comment I'll say is philanthropy could be a lot less risk averse. They're in a position to do truly dramatic, bold things that the federal government will never be able to do. And I would like to see more of that, some more risk capital out there supporting education reform, and particularly some of the new innovative models that are being developed across the country. So I've used up the time. But
No, I mean, I know, and I know we're at time, but I'll ask a question here, Assistant Secretary, to follow. This is my question, which is, we talk a lot about, you have a nice global picture of what's happening across the 54 states and territories.
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about, I think, about the same examples over and over, the Florida example, the Tennessee example. Are there examples
Mexico
of
example,
the New Mexico example? Are there some states doing really bold and innovative work that might not be on the national discussion, that might not be in the national media, that might not be on the national radar screen, that we should all know about as we're listening to you today?
Yeah, I would say there's stuff going on all over the country in pockets. Florida has an advantage because of Jeb Bush having a coherent reform package, putting it in place 20 years ago, and we're seeing the fruits of that. But I have to say, just this morning, I saw some coverage of what Governor Polis is doing with the what's called the Governor's Education Emergency Relief Fund. It's essentially that risky capital I was just talking about. He's part of his fund and using it to encourage the development of new models that are not factory-based. So that's an example. I probably should come up with another half a dozen, but we're sort of out of time. But I can say that the experiment is working. We're seeing lots of things happening around the country to address the needs of children that is far better than having it directed out of Washington.
Thank you. Thanks for engaging in that. I know that was 10 questions in 10 minutes, so that was absolutely wonderful for our audience. I want to go back to Professor Peterson for a final word of appreciation. I want to get his mic and everything turned on here. So I want to go back to him for a final word of appreciation and maybe a final thought for you. But thank you, Mr. Assistant Secretary.
It's good to talk to you, Chris. Thanks.
So thank you, Jim, for that very interesting and forthright presentation, and your responses to questions were informative and illuminating, and I think we all appreciate your willingness to share your time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.